webinar, Women, Military Sexual Trauma and Moral Injury. Stand up, speak up. I'm Nancy Ramsay, the director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School on the campus of TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. The center seeks to provide resources for religious leaders and professional caregivers who support veterans and their families affected by moral injury. Our mission includes offering free monthly webinars that further that mission with a focus on topics that have been inadequately covered or not yet addressed. We are grateful for the support of the Shea Center on Moral Injury at Volunteers of America, which co-sponsors these webinars. Today's webinar looks at the intersections of race and gender in the experience of military sexual misconduct or trauma. It brings important insight on a serious and plaguing problem, that is military sexual trauma, for which Dr. Leslie has authored the only essay easily accessible for religious leaders, Betrayal by Friendly Fire, in Maher and Pryor's 2018 reader, War and Moral Injury. With this webinar, we now add the intersection of race and racism to the issue of military sexual trauma for women. We scheduled this webinar for this February time, trusting that President Biden would quickly cancel the former President Trump's executive order prohibiting federal employees from any conversation about racism. President Biden did cancel it on January 20th, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin now indicates his concern to address these issues as a priority. Later this year, we'll offer a webinar addressing the significant problem of male-on-male sexual misconduct, which is unrecognized by many civilians. Moral injury takes at least two forms. It may be experienced as agential, something we do or fail to prevent. It may be experienced as receptive, something others do to us or fail to do that is an expected aspect of our relationship. Sexual trauma and racism in the military illustrate receptive moral injury. The failure of trust fundamental in obligations between U.S. military troops to care for and protect one another. The leadership for this panel offer expert insight. Dr. Kristen Leslie, a member of the Soul Repair Center National Advisory Board, serves as professor of pastoral theology at Eden Seminary. She is also a subject matter expert on military sexual trauma for the U.S. Navy and the Air Force Chaplain Corps. Captain Judy Malana, a native of the Philippines, is a captain in the U.S. Navy. She has served active duty to ashore, afloat, and forward deployed units with Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard units for over 20 years, and currently serves as regional chaplain for the Naval District, Washington. She's completing PhD work at Salve Regina University. BriGette McCoy is a veteran and the founding and current CEO of Women Veterans Social Justice Network with its offices in Atlanta. The network has a focused concern for women veterans who are survivors of military sexual trauma, and particularly those who are also racially minoritized. She actively supports efforts to meet the needs of women veterans and is a frequent presenter in programs related to such issues. Our program will include presentations by each of these women, then time for conversation among them, followed by their attention to your questions. We will give priority to the questions that you submit to our chat monitor, now Kyle Fauntleroy, a director of development at Brite and a founding member of the center's National Advisory Board, and a retired captain in the Navy Chaplain Corps. We appreciate also the production expertise of Sam McAllister at Volunteers of America. And we want to remind you that this link will be available within 10 to 2 weeks on the site of the Soul Repair Center, the webpage, and also on the YouTube channel of Volunteers of America. So let us now begin with hearing from Dr. Leslie.
Dr. Ramsay, thank you. I want to thank the Soul Repair Center for sponsoring this webinar at this really important time. As you said, in the first months of his new appointment, President Biden's new Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, issued an order, two pretty significant orders. One, which was an executive order overturning what had been in previous administrations, what had suggested that people couldn't talk about sexism or racism. And particularly Secretary Austin order to review how the Pentagon has been handling cases of military sexual assault. That's huge. And if Austin, in fact, Secretary Austin embraces the changes found in the report, he will be the first Secretary of Defense to do so. So this is a really important time for us to be thinking about this. So as this comes into attention on a national level, I think this is the perfect time for us to think about military sexual trauma and assault. So moral injury is often framed in terms of military-related traumas, and most often in relation to combat exposure. Today, we'll look at second type of military-related trauma, that is military sexual trauma, as it affects women. As Dr. Ramsay said in a future webinar sponsored by the Soul Repair Center, colleagues will address men and military sexual trauma. While there's an overlap in trauma responses and trauma-informed pastoral care and care with male survivors, we know cultural narratives about women and men are distinct and as such require culturally competent and gendered informed responses. So I encourage you to tune in to a future time when we have that webinar on military sexual trauma, moral injury, and men. So if you could turn the slide. Our main goal for today is to offer culturally competent, trauma-informed responses to female survivors of military sexual trauma that are both pastorally healing and prophetically redeeming. So to do this, I'm going to start with some definitions, both of moral injury and military sexual trauma, and then turn to some prevalence and the destructive nature of military sexual trauma. Then I'm going to talk about what trauma-informed care looks like a bit, being both compassionate and prophetic. And I will end with kind of a call to action to think about what does it mean if we named something as a prophetic communal goal? What would that look like? And then we'll offer you some, I'll offer you some resources. I'll set that up and then get out of the way because my two colleagues, Judy, Malana, and BriGette, McCoy, we'll take it from there to really get down into the deep work of this work. And I'm so honored to be partnering with them. So next slide, please. So originating in the work of Brett Litz and Jonathan Shea, moral injury is a syndrome of shame, self-handicapping anger, and demoralization that occurs when deeply held beliefs and expectations about moral and ethical conduct are transgressed. And that plays out in two ways. One, and it's important to kind of think about these two parts. One is kind of the acting, failing to prevent or witnessing actions that transgress one's deeply held values, sometimes known as a perpetration-based. And the other one is being betrayed by a trusted authority figure in a high stakes situation. Next slide, please. It becomes important to think about the differences because this first definition of moral injury, which is the one we most often think about, is perpetration-based or agential moral injury. That comes from the work of Larry Graham. That is when someone themselves, they act to either act or fail to act or witness an action that in the end transgresses that which is held most deeply to them. The second definition is really what we're going to be concentrating on today, which is betrayal-based or receptive moral injury. That is when someone is betrayed by a trusted authority or betrayed by the system in a high-stakes situation when there is much to lose. Moral injury was originally understood to be a trauma response experienced by those who engaged in acts of commission, that is killing, or omission, failing to prevent, in the military and often in the battlefield. Very quickly, researchers and caregivers and veterans themselves began to see how the framing of moral injury, agential and receptive, was helpful beyond just the battlefield, but in the context of everyday moral living. So while we'll continue to think about it in the context of the military world, moral injury certainly has implications outside the military as well. So we'll spend time today thinking about the military sexual trauma as a betrayal-based or receptive form of moral injury. Next slide. So lots of definitions here, but I think it's important to, definitions are one way to tell a story about a moral military sexual trauma. So it's a traumatic and debilitating physical, psychological, and spiritual effects that follow a sexual assault while serving in the military. It can be, it's intentional sexual contact, characterized by use of force, threats, intimidation, or abuse of authority, or when the victim cannot or does not consent. In lots of the trainings that I've done with chaplains and their security detail and other folks in the military, it's helpful for them to understand that when the victim cannot consent is an important part of that. So just as a reminder, sexual assault is, we're talking about rape and non-consensual sodomy, oral or anal. We're talking about unwanted sexual contact that is aggravated, abusive, or wrongful, or attempts to commit those acts. And so central to that kind of is both thinking about the physical force. It can be physical force or what's called constructive force, which can be threats and intimidation and abuse of authority. And any system where there's a large hierarchy of power, constructive force plays a huge role in this. And that's true in the military as well. So at the heart of military sexual trauma is betrayal by at least two factions. One, individuals, that is battle buddies, those folks, members of the military who these women are in relationship with, the men, who by definition are tasked with protecting one another, and the betrayal by an institution who claims that its central mission is both good order in discipline and unit cohesion, and that it must attend to its members in order to achieve that mission. So military sexual trauma sits on the top of that sense of violation and betrayal. At the very core of a survivor's trauma is the betrayal of these honor codes. And today we are going to focus on this betrayal-based receptive moral injury. Okay. So let's go ahead, next slide. Let's talk about the prevalence. Statistics are just one way to tell a story, and I'm so pleased to be on this webinar with my two colleagues who will fill these statistics in with their own experiences and stories of working with survivors in a way that I'm a civilian, so I can't. And while I've sat with survivors a lot, and I've sat with many chaplains who work with survivors, I think the weight of the story comes from the survivors themselves. And so I'm honored to be here with my two colleagues as they'll bring in that piece. So central to understanding the impact of military sexual trauma is the high rates of sexual assault and the low rates of reporting. That, I want you to hold on to that idea because that overrides all of this. High rates of assault, low rates of reporting, which directly relate to the effect of the trauma itself. So you see lots of statistics there. Over a third of all active duty and veteran women are survivors of military sexual assault. That's a huge number, a third. 90% took place in a military setting or by military personnel. So in the very place where women were told that if you live into these honorable standards, you will be part of this world, part of this institution, and you will be a significant part of the institution that can achieve a mission that is honorable. If the number of assaults, 90% of them take place in a military setting or by military personnel, it immediately calls into question that very basic notion of honor. And almost 60%, almost 2/3 of the women said they were assaulted by someone higher ranking than themselves, someone in the, which means we all know that in a system of hierarchy like that, where you are to turn and honor those who are above you, to be assaulted by someone in the rank not only affects you personally, but how you fit into the system as well. So 24%, about a quarter, said they were assaulted by someone in the chain of command. That becomes important later on. I'm going to talk about one of the things we're going to call you to do, but that is recognizing currently it's within the chain of command. If someone wants to bring a report against someone, it has to go up through the chain of command. It has to stay within the system. If a quarter of the assaults are by someone who's in that chain of command itself, we recognize the problem of what it means to both where reports don't get pushed through and retaliation is possible. So reporting, 76%, 3/4 of the assaults are not reported as a crime. These are crime statistics from the Department of Defense in 2019. So 3/4 of them were not reported as a crime. In the military, you're aware that there are, particularly in the Navy and the Marines, there's 2 ways to report: restricted and unrestricted. And it's only in the unrestricted does it get reported in a way that can go up the chain of command and fully. In a restricted way, you can get medical and spiritual help, but it doesn't get reported all the way up. So a grand majority are not getting reported up the chain. And the reason why is because this next statistic, 66% of reported folks who did reported retaliation after filing. That's a huge number. So it's no wonder that if you are assaulted in a system, you're not going to report it if you know the retaliation is coming. Interestingly, even though there's such a high rate of retaliation, we know from the statistics, the research done by the Department of Defense themselves, that many women won't report because it's seen as not an honorable thing to do. They don't want to be seen as complainers or acting outside the system, even if the system is not protecting them. They still are equipped and trained to be a member of the system. So you don't want to rat out the system. Unit cohesion, good order, and discipline. That's a pretty prominent guiding rule there. And so you're not going to go up against it. So you see, and much of the research that's done, that even if folks could report, they don't want to be seen as whiners. They don't want to be seen as standing out. They just want to do their jobs. And so they don't report. So the last kind of category of statistics I want to name is the conviction rate. In 2019, of the about 5,699 unrestricted reports that were made, just over 6% went to trial. Think about that for a minute. 6%. And just about 2.5% resulted in conviction. So it means to report means you know you're going to report and retaliation is likely. There's a lot to lose in reporting. And if the conviction rates are low, or if the prosecution rates are low and the conviction rates are even lower, there's not a lot of motivation to go ahead and bring a charge in the first place. So one of the things is I've worked with survivors of military sexual assault is that I regularly work with them as a pastoral counselor to help them recognize healing is not likely going to come in a place of conviction. So where can healing come aside from that, whether or not they choose to report? That becomes an important one. So I want to talk just briefly about, before I turn this over to my colleagues, about what trauma-informed care looks like, because that's in fact what we're going to be talking about when we provide care to survivors of military sexual assault and trauma. We're talking about trauma-informed care, and we're really talking about it in 3 ways. I'm sorry I don't have a slide for this. The first way, this comes from the work of Judith Herman in her book on trauma and recovery, and she talks about it in 3 ways. The first movement is creating safe spaces where survivors can be heard and feel believed. When you think about larger cultural notions of what is considered legitimate suffering and legitimate violence. Sexual assault regularly is not deemed meeting a threshold of legitimacy. So for someone to tell their story, in order for healing to happen, they have to feel believed before anything can happen. We all know that when we feel believed, it's easier to grieve and healing can begin. So that first step is in a trauma-informed care is creating safe enough environment where someone can feel believed. Secondly, is supporting someone so that they can mourn safely and publicly lament. I'm pleased that both with Judy Malana and BriGette McCoy, they're going to talk about those two pieces of it in here a little bit. And then the third one is equipping communities to receive and respond in compassionate and just ways. So those three emotions become so important in a trauma-informed care: creating safe space, supporting mourning and public lament, and equipping communities to receive and respond in compassionate and just ways. Next slide, please. I want to suggest that there are some prophetic communal goals, and perhaps this could go at the end. We can come back to it in our discussion, but I at least want to put them out here. When Judy and BriGette and I talked, we talked about what are some, for takeaways when people leave and in a public arena, what are some things we can do? We came up with 4. 1, legislate, support the work of Senator Gillibrand and others to move prosecution of sexual assault outside the chain of command into civilian courts. 2, fund services that preference cultural competence and trauma-informed care. We all know that in African-American communities, racial ethnic communities, in the military, where it's already doesn't feel safe to come forward, particularly to white power structures, reporting and retaliation is even that much higher. So funding services that are very clear about all of that becomes important. Thirdly, support communal spaces that are committed to receiving and believing personal narratives of MST, and identifying allies in the work. Who's out in the community, who's doing similar work that can support you. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to my colleague, Chaplain Judy Malana.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Soul Repair Center for facilitating this dialogue. And Kristen, I just so appreciate you setting that foundation. And my approach to this topic is really from a chaplain practitioner. So I'll be bringing just some kind of practical experience in walking with survivors of military sexual trauma. I've been an active duty chaplain for over 22 years. And I'm glad we're having this dialogue, because I think we can't assume that everybody has the skills and tools or experience to deal with such a complicated and regrettably such a prevalent topic, and certainly one that's getting a lot of attention. So first and foremost, I really liked what you said about the believability part. So when somebody knocks on my door that wants to talk, I think about what they have gone through. I think about if I was in their shoes. And so my approach as a chaplain to talk with somebody is to realize and really validate how brave they are just to come forward and to say, hey, chaplain, do you have a minute? And let me share with you what happened. And just to go to that believability point, because speaking just as we are in the framework of women in the military, especially women who work in hyper-masculine communities, because there are communities within the military community, and especially as specialties in the military have opened up to women recently in the combat arms fields, there is that sense that to be the trailblazer woman, if you will, to be serving in this environment, that whole cultural piece of, I don't want to be the tattletale, I want to fit in. But when they know that something is not right, when they have been traumatized, they need to come forward, and really meeting them where they are and believing them to a point where not necessarily in that criminal justice system where we're trying to, you know, judge and kind of do that legal believability, but really just from that pastoral sense or from a helper sense, this is a safe space. My office is a safe space. And there's going to be, what I have found, an assumption of why they came to a chaplain to speak to, because they're going to assume maybe a sense of confidentiality. So when I feel someone is approaching me with that issue, I reaffirm them of, you know, the clergy penitent relationship. I reassure them of confidentiality to sort of set that stage to have this conversation happen, and to really have that approach and understand that as they begin to share their story, that you're not shocked or surprised, or that you, in a sense, as a professional, and maybe you haven't had a lot of experience dealing with military sexual trauma, but just to put them at ease, because it is so difficult, I think, for someone just to even knock on the door to tell you their story. So just trying to see it from their perspective, that they've come to you as a helper, somebody that can help them, that can believe them, that perhaps have heard these or experiencing dealing with these stories, and to really put them at ease. So just thinking about some of those issues as you walk people through. And some of the flags, red flags, spiritual red flags that have come up, and at least the folks that I have dealt with, and again, not an exhaustive list of things, but when speaking of, you know, soul repair and the spirituality piece, this whole thing of kind of, is it God's will that this event has happened to me? And I know, you know, some folks may want to say, you know, in time, this will all make sense. But at the time when you're talking with someone who is traumatized, but does have a spiritual understanding or a spiritual worldview, to just give them space to question what has happened to them. And really, we may not have the answers as we walk alongside somebody, but things such as, if I am a person of faith, how could a God who is loving allow this to happen to me? And was really this sexual assault, this rape, was it really God's will? You know, these kinds of things and can come up. And sometimes it's better just to listen and let them process and dialogue about these kinds of questions, and validating these kinds of questions for them without rushing too much to a theological answer, if you will. And so I think if we don't allow people to kind of wrestle with these spiritual issues, there's a danger that they can lose their faith, where they may feel in some ways that God has abandoned them, that they've been betrayed by God, and all of this. So it's just kind of meeting people where they are spiritually, and allowing that kind of question, did God allow, why did this happen to me? And we may not have all the answers, but we certainly want to create that safe space where people can process that. And of course, when you're working through other issues, spiritual issues with folks, you know, this whole notion, you know, well, the scriptures and, you know, my faith teachings tell me I must forgive everybody. And how can I forgive someone who did this to me? And maybe they're not there yet, or they haven't processed, but just hearing that out and giving them that sacred space to hear it out. But conversely, as we work with people who are alleged perpetrators, can God really forgive what I've done? Can you forgive me, chaplain? You know, so this whole issue of forgiveness is another not a red flag, but an indicator of somebody in, if you will, a spiritual crisis or a spiritual tension. And the key is just to really give them that sacred space to talk about that. And certainly the loss of community. And this is, I just want to say, I can't overestimate that whole bit about not wanting to put your brothers on report, let's say, because you've tried so hard to fit in to this, and you didn't want to be labeled, you know, as, you know, there she is, the woman, and oh God, she's got this issue, and if she raises it, you know, she's going to be excluded, this, that, and the other. And women, we, and I could say this, as I was the first female chaplain assigned to a guided missile cruiser back in the late 90s. And I was one of 4 women on this ship. And you try very hard to fit in. And, you know, you don't want to make a stink about things. But for you to come forward when you see something wrong or something that has happened to you is just having that place and realizing that it does take courage. It does take bravery to speak out, to do that. So again, these are just some of those spiritual tensions, the thinking it through issues. And I think some of the key things that we can think about as we walk with folks who are victims, survivors, is really to listen, to affirm, just to make sure they're safe. Do they feel safe in their immediate environment, physically safe, to maintain that trust and confidentiality as they begin to unpeel their story and trust you, to give them room to talk about some of those theological questions and struggles, and help them find those spiritual, maybe more positive coping mechanisms, whether it is finding community, whether it's practicing rituals of faith, whether it's prayer, meditation, whether it's just finding a safe time alone to reflect, meditate, journal, walk in nature, whatever they can to feed their souls. And I know with COVID, it's difficult to do that, but it's not impossible. And I think for caregivers, how much more so should we be intentional to check up on people? We may not be able to see them because of COVID isolation, but we could still pick up a phone. We could still send notes and cards and check up on people. So I just want to offer up those thoughts from a chaplain perspective in walking with folks who have survived military sexual trauma. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to the presenters and continue the dialogue. Thanks.
I think BriGette, there we go.
There we are. I'm here today. Thank you. You had to unmute myself. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be here with, as Dr. Leslie said, my esteemed colleagues, Chaplain Malana and Chaplain Ramsay, Dr. Ramsay. So I'm going to be covering, I've got my screen up and I'm trying to navigate here because a couple of my slides, for whatever reason, aren't working. But what I wanted to present to you is honoring my service, which is reframing moral injury for faith-inspired support of BIPOC women veteran. And so I want to talk about things from a faith-inspired equity and how we can begin to reframe our ideas about care. So as a survivor, and I think that my perspective is going to highlight some of the areas that were discussed previously, but give more depth to the personal experience as a survivor and an advocate. So now when I came on a little bit earlier, I had to get my daughter to get an eyelash out of my eye. Now, the eyelash, I could see it. I knew it was there. I could move it with my finger, but I could not for the life of me get that out with my own hand. And so we had to come upon some different strategies to try to figure it out. Like, how are we going to get this thing out? You've got 5 minutes to get on to have this discussion. And I thought it was very interesting because in the process, I began to relate that to my personal experience as a survivor and a woman who practiced my faith in leadership as a pastoral care counselor, and then someone who was in the community and no one knew that I had experienced sexual assault, right? So we were approaching it. She was trying to help me. She was trying to give me support. And so at some point I had to intervene in and help her help me in the process. And a lot of times with our, with regard to the faith-based communities, I find that there's a experience of women, particularly because that's how I identify, survivors coming into the space, having to be the ones to help craft the care that they're receiving and explain their own experiences in real time. And so as a woman of color, that is very difficult because at some point you have to lay some part of your identity down to begin to have any conversation. And so I need for the everyone to kind of take a moment and think about what I am saying. You're a mother. When you go to work, your job doesn't necessarily want to hear your whole narrative about being a mother. They just want to know, can you do the job, right? When you're coming into care, however, with a chaplain, you have to bring all of those pieces in. Everything about you has to be there. And the person receiving the information has to be willing to accept all of those pieces as you both construct how to care for, how to, you know, solve a problem within the scope of that individual meeting. So I just wanted to bring that in a little here so that we can talk about it further down as we get into faith-inspired equity. And so I think Dr. Leslie, yes, she was presenting about the prophetic communal care responses with a focus on race and culturally competent responses. And so when I was presenting just now, speaking from the perspective of how survivors are having to come into the space and inform the policy or the understanding or the give insight to their own care when they don't even have language many times to describe what they have experienced or the understanding of that experience. And so these are some of the areas that we have to gain some cultural competence. We have to listen to the narratives of women who have experienced sexual trauma. And we have to listen to them from a perspective of on our own time, not as we hear them live in the spaces where we're conducting our practice, right? And so I think that it's important for us to recognize that with trauma-informed care, creating a safe space also means being culturally competent in understanding what's going on before that person comes into the room, so that you have a general understanding of these are the data points for survivors. These are the experiences for survivors. There are going to be, of course, things that come into your space that are new. You don't understand them. You've never heard them before. But in general, there should be some intersection in the conversation with your understanding of what has happened in other survivor space or survivor-based information context, and connecting the dots with the survivor that you're speaking to. As it relates to supporting mourning and public lament, from my own experience, what I have seen is that people don't want the expression of grief beyond a few minutes. You have a time where you said, I'm grieving, I'm feeling bad. And there will be folks who will say, yes, and we've heard this before, or yes, you've spent a lot of time, now it's time to go on. And there is no timeline on grief. Okay, you have to give people space to grieve. There are moments in my life, even 30 years later, that I find that I have grief about an incident that happened to me in general, not just specific to sexual trauma. And so I think it's important that, again, to create a safe space, we have to be open to allowing the grieving and grieving in whatever way feels right for that person. because specifically with Black and Indigenous persons, we have different ways of expressing grief than other groups of people do. And so it's important to not only allow or give space for just a cry or needing a hug, but if that means that someone needs to have a drum circle with their sisters and brothers, and that helps them express their grief, or if that means that someone, in order to shake the grief off, they need to, you know, have a musical expression of that moment. I think that we need to consider that. In my case, I used arts and paint with regard to painting and music and dance as a way to work through some of my grieving, and I found it very helpful. And in being in communities that did that, and so I wanted to go ahead and get into equipping communities to receive and respond. I think I started speaking to that when I talked about allowing from a faith-based perspective, survivors to come into those spaces and begin to have an opportunity to express their grief without being rushed along or shuttled along through the process to get to a positive outcome. Because for some, a positive outcome is expressing the grief that they've pent up for a number of years. And so for some people, it's been decades. When we equip communities, again, I'm going to go back to arts a little bit. One of the best therapy experiences that I had was a therapist who allowed us to dance and play drums and sing, and in my case, draw and sketch while I was in that space. For me, the activity of painting or sketching while I was going through the sessions gave me a better foundation for health, because I could come out of that and I had something to reflect on, and it wasn't just in my head and from an analyzing, thinking point of view, but it was something that I could look at and say, I created this in that space. And then years later, I can go back to that and say, I created this in this space, and have a feeling about it, and can see the difference between where I was at that moment, right? And where I am at this current moment. And so for our communities, the safe spaces and supporting the mourning, all of those things go together. How we speak about trauma, sexual trauma, how we, and this is hard, because in clinical settings, in professional settings, when we're talking about trauma, we have to make sure that we are speaking of it from a perspective of kindness and care and concern, even when we don't perceive a survivor is in that space. And so because I am a survivor, and I am in a lot of spaces, and I have been in spaces where people didn't know I was a survivor, and they were speaking and using terms that I would say were not culturally competent related to survivor. And so I didn't say anything about my background, and I feel like I need to say that I am a 100% service-connected survivor related to sexual trauma in the military. I sustained multiple injuries due to the sexual trauma. And I also experienced retaliation. So as both speakers were talking, and they were talking about, well, actually it was Dr. Leslie was talking about the numbers of retaliation. Not only did I get retaliated against during my service for reporting, after coming out of the military, I was retaliated against because I was continuing to talk about my injuries. And then, from a VA claims perspective, there was also that experience. So you have survivors who are not just sustaining the initial trauma and then having safety and security and support so that they can be healed, you're having survivors who in many times are not necessarily always presenting their identity as a survivor in spaces where conversations are happening that are not culturally competent. I'll use that as a, so no one gets upset with me, but that are not culturally competent. And then those spaces, they're presenting their information, that information is being presented in front of them. And so they know it's not a safe space. And then people are saying, oh, come in and tell us your story, or tell us, be okay with being in this space. And they're like, I already know. And so we have to work really diligently on changing our language, our body language, some of the policies and procedures that are in place related to how we interact with survivors. I understand that there's a thing of no touching, but some people need a hug. Some people need a gentle, is it all right if I pat you on your shoulder kind of moment to be supported. And so in my own experience, those things have been helpful. So when I testified before Senate, one of the things that when I went back and looked at my testimony, I think I was the only one that used the word faith. That I had a lifetime, I lost many material things in emotional relationships and in my lifetime, and struggled with my faith. I grieved because I felt I was the lucky one. I left my unit alive with an honorable discharge. And so for many of our experiences as survivors, there is a survivor guilt that I did leave and I was okay. And because I was able to leave and still maintain some integrity of my benefits, I was lucky. And so you have that other piece that's added on to in relation to the experience. And so if I could encourage you as trusted advisors, which to me, the trusted advisors are clinicians, veteran, chaplain, peers, senior officers, VA employees. Those are trusted advisors in our multidimensional community of behavioral health, family, advocacy community, justice community, research community, educational community, outdoor and recreational, and of course, spiritual community. Like though you're our trusted advisors. And so we've got to make sure that our interpersonal trauma, that we're paying attention to the interpersonal trauma, because the other effects are that military sexual trauma survivors have a higher incidence of homelessness and a higher incidence of suicidal tendencies. And so some of this is exacerbated by the moral injury, the secondary moral injuries of retaliation and the medical claims process. But some of it is just the untreated negative impact of the initial trauma. And so faith-inspired equity and inclusion, make language around neutral, make language neutral, make space and welcome for non-faith-based clients to be heard. Because sometimes there are people who just need an empathetic ear, and it's not about religion. It's not about, which one of the faith leadership personnel is doing what. It's about, will you listen to me? Can you hear me? Will you take a moment just to, and I think that Chaplain Malana said that, something to the effect about healing comes from being someone listening to you. And then also to help make available and remove stigma for use of alternative treatments for trauma related injuries like alpha stem and cymatics. Sound healing, especially in the faith community, I think we fall down a little bit on utilizing things right from the Bible, the sound clapping of hands, the blowing of the shofar, the different musical instruments and things like that. There's a healing or a release that happens, let me not say healing, a release that happens with sound and supportive sound. More soft skill training, specifically interpersonal communications and body language for more human-centered interactions. More times than not, body language opens the door for people to feel comfortable and talk and speak about what their experiences are, or shuts things down. And so those are a few of those areas that like are outside of listening to the narratives of survivors, making equity with women veteran survivors, subject matter experts as co-leads and leads in events like today. We have our leadership here who is, has theory and understands things, but they've brought me along to talk about things in a faith-based perspective as a survivor. And then create space where women, veteran thought leaders, and innovators have a primary voice in their care and treatment. I think a lot of times there are treatments that are already crafted and designed, and everybody's figured out what they want to do and say. And then someone comes in with something non-traditional, and then it's like, oh, here we go. But I think it's okay to bring that into the spaces so that the challenges of homecoming and the battle for validation and the need for safety and choice and all of those things can be incorporated into the design. And so I'd like to propose that we would consider bringing design theory into chaplain services and faith-based spaces so that we can, innovate some of the treatments so that they incorporate some newer ideas to solve some of the bigger issues, like I said, of suicide ideation and things of that nature, because we know what works, but there are also things that we can create hybrids of that can also help to be more efficient or work more effectively. And we definitely need to take into account the BIPOC communities, their traditions, their cultural expressions into those spaces so that we have better, more effective treatments for our survivors. Those are pretty much my main points. Of course, I'm going to always talk about research and making sure that we include the narrative works of women, veteran survivors, subject matter experts. We have a podcast, and you can hear our first person narratives of women who served. Many times when they've spoken on those podcasts, that was the first time they presented that they were sexual assault survivors. So it's very helpful to hear that. And I think that we need to focus on qualitative, utilizing those narratives for our qualitative data as well. So thank you so much for listening today. And I appreciate any questions anyone has when we get into the question and answering part.
Thank you very much, BriGette. And we're going to move now to a conversation among the three presenters. And I've been both tracking some of the questions that have been posed to Kyle Fauntleroy that will come to us in the question and answer period in particular. But I want to lift up a few things and ask you all to elaborate on them and be in conversation with each other. I really appreciated the way in which you were lifting up points that a religious leader or a professional therapist, like a marriage and family therapist, for example, or another kind of therapist might bring to this work. And I appreciated you citing Judith Herman, Kristen, in your opening comments. And I wanted to also remind us that one of the things that Judith Herman lifted up was the importance of bearing witness to the experience of the person and her dignity and the value of her life. But she had a second part to that bearing witness, which was bearing witness publicly to the fact that this happens and that it's wrong, and that we need to be part of the movement to name it and stop it. And so part of what I hope we can talk about from your various perspectives is how those of us that are religious leaders in any religious organization or community leaders, as BriGette has pointed out, some persons may not have a religious tradition, or they may go to another kind of healing moment or healing person. but how can we be more effective in bearing witness that this is a travesty, that the kinds of statistics from 2019 that you cited, Kristen, and let's go by first names now, are really horrible, that they should be an offense to anyone. So could you say some more about how persons that are on this webinar can be part of bearing witness, not only to the, at this point, let's say public witness, to help change the demoralizing statistics that you've shared, both about the level of incidents, but what happens to those who do find the courage to report and then suffer again. The floor is yours.
Okay. I think so. Behavior, and I forgive me because I can't quote anybody right now, but in order for you to have a public acknowledgement, you have to have mental assent. So we have to establish, I recognize internally that this is wrong, and that what has happened to this counterpart or this person or this client is wrong. I don't always feel like all of our religious leaders feel that way. Mm. And I think that that's a huge problem. And I can say that on multiple levels, because I work within folks with their chaplain. I was in the ministry in praise and worship for a number of years. And then I was in teaching and training future pastoral care counselors. So I've seen the scope. I'm not, and again, I hesitate to say that because there will always be someone say, well, not all chaplains or not all religious leaders. And it goes back to that same thing that happens with when you say, as a survivor that was raped, someone will inevitably say, well, not all men rape. And so the knee-jerk response is to protect, because the mental ascension that it is wrong has not actually been assimilated into the identity. There's still some element of question there, because it's like I'm leaving myself open that maybe this person lied, or I need more evidence. And so that's where we have to start with the internal part, and there may be, one of the other panelists can speak to that.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to just share a thought. So I think it's important as a caregiver to think about what your own motives are and who actually owns the story. So in other words, if we are holding to the sacred trust of confidentiality, we don't own that individual's trauma or story. And I have found it helpful to ask, how do you want me to help you? I mean, I know what I'd like to do, but it's not my story. So I try to meet folks where they are. Some may want to tell their story, be more of an advocate, are ready to do that. Some others may not be. Some others may be re-traumatized by the various questions they have to go through the institution. The trauma of going to the medical officer and getting examined, the trauma of doing an intake with sexual assault counselor, the trauma of having to retell the story to the command, the trauma of wondering who knows my story in the military, the trauma of being expedited from one command to another, and wondering if all of that drama that happened at another unit in another place is going to follow you.
Right.
Because, while you may be out of that unit into this unit, it doesn't mean that band of military folks don't communicate to one another. So I just want to say, how can I help walk alongside? What can I do? And if it is releasing me from confidentiality, happy to help in whatever way, but I just have to check, whose story is it? Whose story is it?
Let me ask Judy and try to clarify that I wasn't I wasn't speaking particularly to bearing witness about a particular woman's experience. I was talking about bearing witness to the level of incidence and so far the systemic failure to stop it, to reduce it. And so I completely agree that honoring the particular experience of someone is absolutely essential.
I think it's to have the prophetic voice.
Exactly. That's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think if you are advising on a strategic level, is to do all your homework and have your elevator speech ready. And while we might just want to, you know, go at it and say it, sometimes it's these strategic conversations happen behind closed doors when the opportunity as an advisor happens. And sometimes that's building a relationship with decision makers. Decision makers who may not even know they need to make decisions on these things because they don't even know it's a problem. But how do you get at that table of strategic advisement unless you develop relationships with strategic advisors to where you can have a door open to you? And that is the relationship building, that is being a trusted agent, you know, checking in on folks and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of relationship building, but doing your homework, knowing who the key stakeholders are. And then when you are having that prophetic moment to speak and not be afraid. You know, just real quick, I had a very passionate conversation with my admiral, and he said, "Did you read the Fort Hood report? It's a travesty, soldiers are dying." And he was so passionate about it. And it was just a door open to say, okay, what can we do? We may not be able to change the big Navy, but what can we do today in our region? What can we do in our gardens? Or, well, let's do this. So we will take a direction and do what we can in our little garden here. And I say our little garden of Naval District, Washington, to lean forward. And we've leaned forward on other things, on diversity and inclusion issues, where, you know, we're just like, we just need to be prophetic,
right?
Whatever role we're in.
All right. Well, I'm going to come back to this, but let me invite Kristen to join us. Kristen, you're presently muted.
So I've been thinking about bearing witness in a couple different ways. And I know within faith traditions, particularly Christian tradition, one of the ways that we talk about bearing witness is to be vocal. And to share one's faith and one's belief and one's passions. And I'm mindful that to bear witnesses, as you also to say, is to receive something, to stand with, and to receive. I'm mindful that within faith communities, it means using your public forums to name, to preach on, to speak on, and to call out. I teach a class on pastoral care in the public arena, and one of the things we do is we teach students how to write op-ed pieces, because that is an important thing where members of the faith community put their voice out into the public arena, because we all know those faith voices matter around these issues, and particularly around an issue of military sexual trauma, where some would suggest it's not polite to talk about. I think we need to change that narrative to say, in fact, I'm going to talk about this because it has to do with suffering and the thriving of humanity and the thriving of people. So to talk about it. Diane Labode, who's an American religious historian, talks about early Methodists. I'm United Methodist. She talks about early Methodists, and she talked about them being noisy believers. And I firmly believe that if we're going to be working with survivors where the larger cultural narrative says, I don't believe you, and only this much is really harm. So I'm in the state of Missouri, where several years ago, Troy Aiken talked about legitimate rape, as in all this stuff is not legitimate, only this much is. So because that's a larger, I so appreciated that he named that, because, well, I think it was hugely problematic, but he named what so many people believe, that people name that somehow only this much is real and the rest is just malingering.
Right.
And so it becomes a religious professional's role, I think, and the faith community's role to help people publicly lament so that we can be noisy believers. Noisy believing matters in this context.
I want to come back to lament in a moment, but I want to underscore a coincidence here, because across my lifetime, which is long, the level of incidents of violence against women in the country, regardless of military service, has not diminished. And the home is the most dangerous place for women and children to be. So we know that there's a kind of, some people call it a holy silence about that from pulpits. So we might not be surprised then that it goes over into military contexts. Perhaps with regard to this particular issue, the fact that we seem to have a Secretary of Defense now who's willing to name it and address it does give an extra oomph, so to speak, to religious leaders and community leaders to talk with representatives so that we might hope to change that system. I want to go to something else you said. I see that, BriGette. I'm also looking at the clock. You mentioned something about bearing witness and lament. And of course, at least in Jewish and Christian scriptures, bearing witness is exactly what the person lamenting needs. So I wonder if you all might talk briefly about how, whether we're a secular counselor of some sort or another, or a religious leader, to say more about how we might effectively bear witness to the importance of their lives, to honoring their lives and honoring the pain, and that we're recognizing their humanity as a part of recovery.
Mm-hmm. So I'll jump in. I'll be short because I want to hear what my colleagues have to say. I know that when I work with survivors, and I particularly would like to hear what Judy and BriGette, kind of their take on this is, when I work with survivors, one of the things I'd like to do is equip them to know that they are allowed to ask questions to figure out if an environment is safe enough for them to share their story. Mm-hmm. Because for someone to be traumatized by telling their story when they're already traumatized, it can be disruptive of their healing. So one of the things I do is I spend time talking about what it's fair to expect of a healing environment, a healing community, a healing person. And I have a list of those things that I share, but I'm wondering if Judy and BriGette, if you would be willing to name, what do you tell people the kinds of questions they should ask in order to know, so they can figure out what's safe enough for them?
Remember to unmute.
So I'm a feeling person. Like, I feel like if you go into a space, you have enough mental wherewithal, emotional wherewithal to know that this is an open, welcome, honoring space. And if you don't know that right away, to take a moment and discern it for yourself, not based on what someone has said or put on a placard or given you on a piece of paper for you to sign, but that you decided internally, and that you have the locus of control. You have the space inside you to say, hey, I recognize that this is not a good place for me to share this, or I can share a portion of it, test out the space to see how what I did share is received, to determine if there's any, if I should invest further into this space or to this person or project or program.
I think, thanks for that. And I think it took me a while to kind of process the question, and really keying on that there is a physiological response to our emotions. And while we may not be able to name the individual emotions, if we could take a step back and see if there are any, first off, physiological changes. Are we feeling safe? Are we not feeling safe? But that it's okay if we can't even name what we're going through. And having at least one person or person that they can trust to bounce these ideas off of is, I think, is very helpful. But that is such a complicated question. So I'd be definitely curious to see if there are any best practices on determining these kind of safety issues.
I have one more question for you, Judy, that responds to that, I hope, or at least tangentially, before we turn it over to questions from the audience. You would know better than the others of us, I think, although Kristen is a subject matter expert, and this is what BriGette addresses all the time. But I'm interested in presently, how is education about this incorporated into chaplaincy training, either for military chaplains and or for VA chaplains?
And that's a very good question. I think that the question for me behind the question is, what is the standard of training? And is it consistent training? And what is in there? And I know initially when the SAPR program was beginning, there was a competency framework. You must include these things by OSD to put in the SAPR training. In other words, chaplain, check your bias. Do you have any religious bias that might hinder you from working with someone who's traumatized? There was a whole list of framework. Now, whether those are, now OSD can put out frameworks, but the services, they can't enforce them to the services. And so the question becomes, yes, there's training. We could always say there's training, but the real question is it standardized training? To what standard? Is it collaborative? And whose accountability is it really to hold units accountable for it? And should there really be different training? I don't know, but the question is, yeah, we could say it just like with the diversity issues, just like with any other issues. Yeah, sure, there's training. Is it effective? Have we measured? Well, let's just take a look at the numbers. Let's just see. We just have a long way to go. So thank you for that question.
Well, then I guess if there's the follow-up of, you know, what can civilians do to support improving, you know, the implied answer of regarding adequate training?
And I definitely would like to speak to that, because I struggle with the fact that the governing bodies that license the folks to go into the military as chaplains and their faith-based bylaws are sometimes, I perceive, I'm not a chaplain at this point, are in conflict, right? We have the updating of language happens all the time, but I don't always hear that coming from a religious based focus coming forward. So if the religious leaders are training and developing, but they're not updated on they don't have the most up-to-date understanding of, you know, gender pronouns and things of that nature, then they're governing over who goes into the chaplaincy. And so they have control over that. And so they don't want to lose that big Department of Defense opportunity to move chaplains in there. So there's that big circle of, like Judy was saying, you know, like who's checking to see that it's, you know, it's working. How are we assessing it? How are we evaluating it? And who is the evaluating and assessing body? And so if it's the faith, if it's the individual faith that is, you know, sending their pastor into the chaplaincy, then they're assessing it from their point of view. But is it on a global, or is it just focused specifically on the area of that particular religious leadership? And so I think we had two separate trainings last year's 2020, for chaplains through a co-hosted program that we did. We had maybe 200 people total attending. I don't know specifically how many were military chaplains and civilian chaplains. But, you know, one of the things that a couple of things that we covered were things like cultural competence, things about related to the BIPOC community and things of that nature, because there's a different Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. There's a difference, like I said, even in the, I mean, we can just take a visual of Sunday morning and go to, you know, a Pentecostal church during praise and worship, and a, you know, a holiness church, and, you know, a Catholic church. It's very different. And I've been in all of those settings on various levels of service. So that would show you immediately that those understandings and how they're played out comes into the military, and how those folks who are in the military serving and responding from a chaplain perspective are bringing, like Judy said, their own biases. And those biases are being supported because you don't want to lose your licensure, right? You got to follow the rules, the bylaws of your licensing agent. So that's going to always be in conflict, especially when it comes to a transgender. If a transgender woman comes and says, I've been raped, what are you going to do when your faith doesn't? You're going to send them to someone else when it's you they've come to? So there's just all these granular nuances that really, I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to have the conversation. I'd love to get into them because I've discussed them privately, and I think it's time for a public forum of like that level of conversation with our Black and Indigenous and persons of colors, with our transgender and LGBTQ communities, and our aging communities. Because there's this whole other thing of, you know, women who've experienced sexual trauma in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you know, and people are saying, oh, you should be okay. Well, if the first time that they've ever spoken about it was in 2020, they can't be okay. There's a process that has to happen, and we have to give space to that. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of challenges. Ultimately, cultural competency, I think, is the answer, but who is going to determine how that is administered and evaluated across all of the religious orders that license is going to be the key.
Okay, let's shift gears, and you might have seen some of the questions that Kyle Fauntleroy has been sending, and I've asked him to send me some other ones, but I'd appreciate it if you could talk about, for example, what if the offender is a chaplain? You know, that could happen. It certainly happens in secular life. I mean, in the secular culture or wider non-military culture. How does somebody? Are there alternatives for reporting?
Based on my military experience, again, I'm not speaking for the Navy or the Department of Defense, but as an individual person, I would say use the system. There is a system in place. Nobody should get a pass because of what they do in the military. Chaplain or no chaplain, whatever position they're in, there is a system. And I would encourage folks to use the system to put that person on report. Mm-hmm. The system.
So Judy, does that involve going to the SAPR officer then?
Yes, go through it. There is a military system, and I encourage people use the system.
Are there questions you'd like to ask each other while we gather some more questions from the audience?
Well, I would like to address Jack Lee. They sent a message about the vast diversity within the endorsers who sponsor chaplains to the military, and that the military struggles to bring them up to speed on many of the challenges they will face in service. The academic institutions are one place to begin the critical thinking necessary to prepare all clergy, not just military chaplains, to effectively address this issue in a compassionate way. And so I absolutely agree. And so I think it is important that we have all manner of academic excellence as it relates to chaplaincy training. But it's going to be difficult. I lecture, probably it's been 3 or 4 years ago, no, 2 years ago, about sexual trauma in the military and at the academic institutions, and how the macro and the micro levels of how they correlate exactly. They lay, you can pretty much lay all of the experiences across and remove just the military or the college institution. And the students want to have the conversations. The professor brought me in so that we could have the conversation. So how do we bridge as academics, right? How do we bridge and make ourselves available to begin to have those conversations on an academic level, so that the student body has access? Because maybe the professor doesn't necessarily have competence in that area or feel comfortable with presenting some of those conversations in a secular setting, is what I'm saying, not necessarily.
So institutional support, even at the MDiv educational level, that really naming this as a problem, that's certainly widespread, but not universal in training in MDiv education. That's for sure. And are there ways in which, there's a question that we've received, is military sexual trauma, what's the, is there some level of so-called seriousness? Does it have to go beyond touch, for example? Or do you find, Judy, when you're hearing and you report it up, are there levels or degrees, so-called, of transgression that are necessary for this to be valued as an offense?
There are certainly definitions that the military uses, and whether it's harassment, whether it is assault, it's pretty outlined on what those things are, and which could be criminal and what's not criminal. But I would say that if anybody feels that that has happened to them, certainly bring that information forward. Mm-hmm. And that's critical. I mean, there shouldn't, what we don't want to say is, it goes back to kind of validating mm-hmm. that person that comes to the door, and, being, being the recipient of sexual harassment and wondering, well, should I say something? And then having a senior female chaplain say, well, were you raped? Well, if you weren't raped, so I wouldn't say anything. And it was like, So was that the right response to me as a lieutenant junior grade at the time? Or should it have been, hey, something happened that wasn't right. Let's bring it up and put the report in. And so I just think that there's more definition on things, and people should just use the system. I don't know how other way to explain it, but we shouldn't present an obstacle to people voicing what they experience, and just keep validating that. Right.
There's been I'm sorry, go ahead, BriGette. You're.
And so that is one of the bigger challenges is within my organization, we have women who have worked with us for years, and they're just now coming to me saying, I'm finally getting it. Because there's language, there's consistent, ongoing language that validates if you've experienced this, and this. These things all fall within the realm of sexual trauma in the military, especially when it's added on to the fact that you felt uncomfortable in that space. Go back to your feelings. Do you feel safe in this space? You do not, then let's figure out what it is that's keeping that keeping you from feeling safe when there is a safe space, and how to describe the unsafe space when you realize that you were in a space that you didn't feel comfortable. The listening sessions that I've done, I'm always amazed. I have 12 women on the phone. They say they never experienced sexual trauma, and I don't describe it. I don't give them words. I talk about incidents and what happened. I give them the experience, and then I let them say, have you ever, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget it, because I sometimes forget it. Does that give you insight on the experience from a lived experience that I've experienced? Have you had a similar lived experience that reflects this type of incident? Completely different response, but it is in the language. And so we're stepping into spaces where language, unfortunately, has been a weapon. It's been weaponized. And so just like Judy said, if you go into a space and someone says, have you been raped? Your first thing is, rape is a bad word. You don't say it, you don't speak it, you don't even look at it, you cover it with your hand when you see it. And so now somebody's shouting it to you or saying it in a way that's going to make you feel unsafe. You're not going to agree, even if it was your experience. So I think, like I said earlier in my part of the presentation, language is a key to this. And we have we have to define that language and shift it.
I think just thank you for sharing that, because I think, well, what would I tell myself that junior officer 20 years ago? I probably would have a different approach and say, name it, advocate for it, and point it out. And you should not feel like you have no control, or that there's this fear or obstacles. You tell the truth,
right?
And you see where it goes. But we cannot, to have the voice, we have voices, we should speak. And so different approach than I would have 20 years ago. So I appreciate that there is language, there is mechanisms probably more defined, and people more readily to listen than perhaps there were 20 years ago.
There's one term that we've used, but we haven't defined. And I want to go back, BriGette, I'm going to start this question with you. And it's relating to the term culturally competent, because part of the way that I understand that term would include, for example, mindfulness. If I'm caring for a woman who's part of a group that has experienced rape over centuries, to then be a service person for the country, and to have that experience again, there's a different resonance, isn't there? And I wonder if you could talk about that as one way of explaining what culturally competent care means.
So there absolutely is. And unfortunately, religiously within the veteran community, there is this idea that we all bleed green, or we're all Americans, we all have the same experience. And so from one to all of us here, we could be in the same room. One might be cold, one might be hot, one might feel it's perfect, and one might just want to get out of there because they just can't stand the energy, right? So we cannot perceive that on a general level. So we got to respect that each individual, especially the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, have had a systematic raping, the stealing of our land, of our ideas and concepts, of how, of all of these things. And so those things go very closely to rape, right?
Right.
My daughter was like 5 or 6 years old, and I was explaining to her what happened to me in the gentlest way I could. She said, "That's stealing, Mommy. They're stealing from you." And I said, now, if she can get it, we know what it is.
Right.
So we have to be able to, help people to understand that your body is your property. And we got to touch this, though, because historically women were property, right?
Exactly.
And so it wasn't until the 1970s, in some states, women could own property without having signatory status of a man alongside of it, right? So we've got to recognize that we still have some of those entanglements in our laws, in our ways of thinking, and how we organize communities. And so, you know, there was this exchange thought process that women give their bodies to a man for support, right? And so men still have some of those thoughts. They feel like you should give them your body so they can buy you a dinner or buy you a house and those kinds of things. And that unfortunately ties in with ownership of Blacks and Indigenous persons, because we're not, in some people's eyes, we're still not considered people.
Right. And I wanted to make sure that we had that point elaborated before we close, because it is time to close now. And I want to express my deep appreciation to you three for your leadership and depth of this. I want to remind everyone that's still on the chat or on this webinar that within 10 days to 2 weeks, this webinar and the associated PowerPoints will be available to you. And I thank you again, women, for your preparation and for a really extraordinary webinar. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.